Welcome to the discussion video on accounting for franchise operations focused on the franchisor books. At the end of the module, we will be able to define a franchise contract. We apply the general and specific principles of Pfrs 15 in recognizing revenue from franchise contracts. So our guiding standard is Pfrs 15, revenue from contracts with customers. Just like on our previous module related to construction contracts, we are guided still by Pfrs 15. So we will use the provisions of the standard related to revenue from contracts with customers. So let us summarize the core principles under PFRS 15, which are already been discussed on the previous module on construction contract. So let us take a look yung the steps in identifying the revenue recognition principle under PFRS 15. One is yung the identification of the contract with the customer. If you will remember, we look at the collectibility of the consideration being probable. So kung probable yun ang ina-identify natin as a basis in recognizing revenue. Step 2, we identify the performance obligations in the contract. Dito diniscuss natin yung classification whether the delivery or the good or the service is distinct or a separate is this a distinct good or service in the contract is treated as a separate performance obligation. So we identify whether it is distinct or not distinct. Step 3, we determine the transaction price. So when we say the transaction price, it will cover the amount which is needed to satisfy the performance obligation. Under step 4, we'll look at the allocation of the transaction price to the performance obligation. So how do we allocate the transaction price? It will depend on whether it is satisfied over time under step 5, recognize revenue when or as a performance obligation is satisfied or when it is a point in time. So basically, yung steps na ginamit mo on construction contracts will also be used in this module, yung franchisor books. So let us make some terminologies for us to be familiar. When we say licensing, as identified under PFRS 15, it provides specific principles that relate directly to the accounting for franchises. The specific principles are to be applied in addition to the general principles. So when we say PFRS 15 defines that when we say a license, it is one that establishes a customer's rights to the intellectual property of an entity. So it is the general term under the umbrella of the definition license. We include sample of licenses of intellectual property, which includes 1, software and technology, motion pictures, music, and other forms of media and entertainment. C, franchises, the patents, trademarks, and copyright. So franchises is just an inclusion in the general terminology license. So our focus now is the term franchises. A franchise is a contractual arrangement under which the franchisor grants the franchisee the right to sell or certain products or services, to use certain trademarks or trade names, or to perform certain functions, usually within a designated geographical area. So when we say a franchise, this is basically you allow another entity to use the goods or service, the trade name, and other business essentials for profit. So there are several examples. Yung fast food chains like McDo, Jollibee, 7-Eleven, and others are typical examples of franchises. Even yung mga small owners, owners like Shomai, Fries, they are into a franchise agreement. So, as an accountant, how do we account for the revenue we generate on the franchise? And as that is the focus of the attention, because in this module, you are the franchisor. So, ikaw yung may-ari ng business, and then ikaw yung nagbigay ng right. So, ikaw yung kikita ng revenue on this item. So there are two types of franchises: the contractual arrangement between two private entities or individuals. For example, uh, Company R and Company S, they are private entities, so nag-agree sila uh, to a franchise agreement. Kumbaga si Company R, inallow niya na gamitin yung trade name and copyright para sa business ni Company S. So, ganun. So, pwede rin na private entity and then the government. So, pwedeng individual and then government. So, pwedeng private to private, pwede ding private to government. When we say private here, it can be an entity or a company or an individual. Okay. What is an example of a private entity contracting to a government? One good example is yung franchise on land transportation, uh, yung kinukuhang franchise para makapag uh, yung prangkisa sa motor, sa jeep, sa bus, these are franchises on land transportation, kaya yan ay kinukuha sa LTFRB. Another example is the broadcasting companies like ABS-CBN and GMA. They are franchising the airwaves or the frequency. So that is an example. Basically, we apply Pfrs 15 in the recognition of the contracts with customers. And it is better for us to identify this when we look at the examples. Okay. Basically, itong step 1, identify the contract with the customer. Ito ay na-discuss na doon sa previous module on construction contract because these are still principles under Pfrs 15. Okay? Yung no revenue is recognized on a contract does not meet the criteria. Ito rin po yung nandoon sa PFRS 15 na ginamit natin the construction contract. Let us look at the example. The assessment of the criteria for identifying a contract. ABC company licenses its proprietary processes to XYZ in exchange for usage-based royalty and at contract inception, criteria A to E above are met. So, itong criteria ang sinasabi na yun. What does a usage-based royalty? Ibig sabihin dito kung mas marami mo siyang nagamit yung proprietary process o yung business process ni ABC ay mas malaas ang royalty na babayaran mo. Pero kung kakaunti lang, mas maliit. Kaya siya usage-based yung royalty niya. So, what is the accounting here? ABC accounts for the contract in accordance with PFRS 15 and recognize revenue when XYZ subsequent usage occurs. In year 2, XYZ continues to use ABC's process but XYZ's financial condition declines. XYZ pays only a portion of the year's billings. XYZ's current access to financing is limited. So, how do we account for this? ABC continues to recognize, as the franchisor, ABC will continue to recognize revenue based on XYZ's usage, but accounts for any impairment of the existing receivable in accordance with PFRS 9 financial instruments. So, when it is probable that the collection will have uh, when we look at the collection, there is a probability that it cannot be collected, doon natin ini-incorporate yung recognition of impairment. Kaya yun yung tinutukoy niya dito. In year 3, XYZ continues to use ABC's processes but XYZ has lost major customers and access to financing. Thus, XYZ's ability to pay significantly deteriorates. So, nag-deteriorate pa yung ability ni XYZ as the franchisee na magbayad kay ABC. As a result of the significant change in facts and circumstances, ABC reassesses criteria A to E above and determines that it is no longer probable that ABC will collect the consideration. So, upon analysis ni ABC as a franchisor, parang there is a probability of non-collection or partial lang yung pwedeng makolekta. So how do we account for those scenario? Ang sabi, ABC will stop recognizing further revenue from XYZ because of the concept of conservatism. XYZ's future usage of the processes and accounts for any impairment of the existing receivable in accordance with PFRS 9 financial instruments. So when it is there is a significant the probability of non-collection is high as identified in the terminologies in the tenor of the paragraph. um, the franchisor will need to reassess yung criteria A to E, and kapag na-identify niya na hindi na nga probable yung collection, hindi na siya pwedeng mag-recognize ng further revenue dyan. Kasi if you will recognize further revenue and nakikita mo na mayroong significant deterioration on the ability to pay ng iyong franchisee, this will violate the conservatism principle. Okay, next, identify the performance in the contract. This is essentially the same doon sa diniscuss natin sa construction contract. Kung mapapansin mo yung distinct, series of distinct, customer can benefit, promise, separately identifiable. So, we look at the application, okay? So, ito rin po yun, yung overtime at the point in time. Yung simultaneous receives and consumes the benefits, the customer controls, and then does not create an asset with the alternative use. Diba ito ay na-discuss na natin on the construction contract module. So let us look at the specific principles under the licensing section of the Pfrs. So a contract to grant a license to a customer may include other promises to provide additional goods or services to the customer, whether explicitly stated in the contract or implied by the entity's customary business practices. Just like with other types of contracts, the entity shall apply the general principles in step 2 above to identify each of the performance obligations in the contract. So we have to identify whether it is distinct or not distinct. Okay? When the promise to grant the license is not distinct, kapag hindi distinct, how do we account for it? It is a single performance obligation. Kasi hindi mo siya mapaghiwalay. Okay? Yung license and then yung pag-accomplish ng function, yung performance obligation, at saka yung mismong license ay hindi mo siya mapaghiwalay. Ibig sabihin, it is a single performance obligation accounted on its entirety. The entity determines whether the performance will be satisfied over time or at a point in time using the general principles. Okay? Example of a license that are not distinct from other goods, yung hindi mo mapaghiwalay. A license that is integral to the functionality of a tangible good. For example, a software embedded to a machine. So, yung software, ito yung fina-franchise mo kasi bibigyan ka ng license for that para magamit mo yung software na yan. Magagamit mo ba yung software if it is not embedded to a machine? No. Kaya nga, it is considered as accounted for as a single performance obligation. Next, a license that the customer can benefit from only in conjunction with a related service. Example, software with web hosting arrangement. Okay. Next, what if the promise to grant license is distinct, yung pwede mo siyang mapaghiwalay, you treat it as a separate performance obligation. However, when we look at this, the entity determines whether the separate promise to grant the license will be satisfied over time or at a point in time. So meron condition whether you will recognize it as an overtime or at a point in time. So how do we determine? You have to identify whether it is a right to access or it is a right to use. What does it mean when it is a right to access? The entity's intellectual property as it exists throughout the license period. Next, i-compare and contrast natin. The entity's intellectual property as it exists at the point in time at which the license is granted. Okay, tingnan, read more. If the customer has the right to access the intellectual property as it exists throughout the license period, the performance obligation is satisfied over time. Kasi nga, binigyan ka ng access on a particular intellectual property, whether it is a franchise on a particular item or good, or a technology over the license period. Ibig sabihin, pag ganun yung condition, it is satisfied over time. Therefore, the amount of consideration allocated to the promise to grant the license is recognized as revenue over the license period. Remember, revenue over the license period. However, if the customer has the right to use the intellectual property as it exists at the point in time at which the license is granted, the performance obligation is satisfied at the point in time. Therefore, revenue is recognized at the time when the license is provided. Okay, let us look at this more. Kasi baka malilito ka yung over the license period and when the license is provided. So let us look at more. The customer has the right to access the entity's intellectual property as it exists throughout the license period if the customer cannot direct the use of and obtain substantially all of the remaining benefits from the license at the point in time at which the license is granted. This is the case if the intellectual property to which the customer has rights changes throughout the license period. So, paano ba mag-change yung rights ng customers? The entity continues to be involved in its intellectual property, and next, the entity undertakes activities that significantly affect the intellectual property to which the customer has rights. Ibig sabihin, meron pa ring intervention yung franchisor on the particular intellectual property na franchise. Let us look kapag right to access. When it is right to access the entity's intellectual property, if all of the following are met, the contract requires the customer reasonably expects that the entity will undertake activities that significantly affect the intellectual property to which the customer has right. The customers granted by the licensee directly expose the customer to any positive or negative effects of the entity's activities, and those activities do not result in the transfer of a good or a service to the customer as those activities occur. Okay. So the prime distinction between the two is for you to determine whether it is a right to access or a right to use, because it will be essential in your identification or in your accounting. So when we look at right to access, it is more of merong kang kumbaga, there are several franchisee na binibigyan ng access on a particular technology. Kapag right to use naman on a particular technology during a particular license period, so yan ay nag-expire. However, kapag right to use naman, normally ang orientation niyan ay pag ibinigay na sa iyo yung right na gamitin mo yung particular technology na yon. When I say technology, it encompass all the terminologies na in-identify natin kanina. Once na ibinigay na yun sa iyo, ay you have the right to utilize the technology and the resources associated to that. Okay? Okay. If the customer has the right to access the intellectual property, the promise to grant a license is a performance obligation satisfied over time. Okay? And when it is right to use, it is satisfied at a point in time. Okay? Right to use the entity's intellectual property as it exists at the point at which the license is granted. If the customer can direct the use, okay, I think I already have discussed this. Okay, eto rin. Yung sales-based and usage-based royalties, I have already discussed that. So this tabulation will give you a quick guide of the principles na diniscuss natin. So, yung identification whether the license is not distinct or distinct. So kapag distinct, you treat the promise to grant the license as a separate performance obligation, and then you will use specific principles to determine if the promise provides the customer right to access or right to use. Kasi nga, may bearing yan kung ano ang gagamitin mong accounting, if it is over time or at a point in time. Then, eto yung distinction nila. The customer cannot direct the use and obtain all the remaining benefits from the license as the time it was granted. The customer can direct the use of and obtain all the remaining benefits. So, yun yung compare and contrast niyan. The intellectual properties changes throughout the license period. The entity continues to be involved with the intellectual property. The entity undertakes activities that significantly affect the IP. However, in the right to use, IP does not change throughout the license period. Okay? Yung right to access, it may be evidenced by a sales-based royalty agreement between the entity and the customer. Okay. So let us look at this, yung illustration 1, yung identification of a distinct license. So an entity, a pharmaceutical company, licenses to a customer its patent rights to an approved drug compound for 10 years and also promises to manufacture the drug for the customer. The drug is a mature product. Therefore, the entity will not undertake any activities to support the drug, which is consistent with its customary business practices. When we say customary business practices, it is the normal, yun na yung nakasanayan na business practice niya. So case 1, if the license is not distinct, the tenor of the item should be no other entity can manufacture this drug because of the highly specialized nature of the manufacturing process. As a result, the license cannot be purchased separately from the manufacturing services. So hindi mo siya matanggal, hindi mo siya ma-separate, kaya siya ay not distinct. Okay? Next, we identify the performance obligation in the contract. So each promise, good or service that is distinct is treated as a separate performance obligation. A good or service is distinct. Okay, ito yun. Yung a customer can benefit and is separately identifiable. Hence, because it is not distinct, the promises are treated as a single performance obligation. Okay, next, case number 2. If the license is distinct, the tenor will be the manufacturing process used to produce the product is not unique or specialized and several other entities can also manufacture the drug or the customer. Hence, kung ganyan, if it can be separated, it is treated as a separate performance obligation. Okay? Separate performance obligation, 1, yung license, at yung pangalawa, yung pag-manufacture. Magkahiwalay siya. Unlike on the case number 1, wherein hindi mo mapaghiwalay kasi nga because of the highly specialized nature daw of the manufacturing process. No other entity can manufacture. So yun. So it will be based on how it is identified. Step 3, we identify the transaction price on the contract. Okay? The transaction price is the amount of consideration to which an entity expects to be entitled in exchange for transferring service or goods. Okay? Excluded yung sales taxes or amounts collected in behalf of third parties. Essentially, itong A to E ay na-discuss na rin natin ito on construction contract kasi nga Pfrs 15 pa rin itong steps na ginagamit natin. Variable consideration, constraining estimates, ito daw yung makaka-affect dun sa consideration. Existence of a significant financing component, non-cash consideration, consideration payable to a customer. Na essentially, yan ay ina-identify naman sa problem kung aling mga item yun. You don't need to memorize yung mga enumerations na nandyan. Ang magandang i-practice mo is on you on how to solve and how to remember concepts while you are solving the problems. I think I have to end this first part of the video. Please continue on the succeeding video as we introduce yung franchise fees na at yung mismong initial franchise fee, yung continuing franchise fees na the cream of the crop on the discussion related to franchises. Thank you.